stand-up comedians of the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Next on Retro Serial. Hey everyone, welcome to Retro Serial. I'm your host, Ian C. I'm glad you keep joining us for today's program. On today's program, we have reoccurring guest Thrashpondo and I, where we're going to be talking about the stand-up comedians that affected us most as GenXers, what we were listening to, what we like, and kind of how it evolved, and even up to some of our favorite stand-up comedians of today. Before we get to that interview, let me remind you to go ahead and hit that subscribe button, hit the like button, hit the share button. Share it on your favorite social media, and if you want to know when these things are available, hit that bell notification. Those things mean the absolute world to me. If you're also listening to this on podcast, please don't forget to rate and leave a comment. Again, means the world to me. If you want to go that one extra step, you can always follow the link below to the Patreon page where I have a tip jar available, but I'm also working on some unique stuff over there where you're going to get early episodes for tiers that are going to be available real soon there. So thank you for all that, and we're going to go ahead and just jump right into the interview. All right, with me via the internets is Thrashpondo Ponds, and we are going to get right into today's conversation. I already did an introduction to this, so we are going to be talking just a quick introduction to the introduction to the introduction. Stand-up comedy. Thrashpondo, did you grow up watching stand-up comedy through your life?
I sure did. Both my mother and my father were huge fans of stand-up comedy. Oftentimes a little more risque than I was allowed to actually partake in. In fact, one of my earliest memories, I was probably maybe as early as 4. I remember they were listening to Red Fox, who was considered very, very risque at the time. And I remembered him, of course, from Sanford & Son. So I couldn't figure out why they weren't letting me watch Sanford & Son. It's because it was a stand-up. And not just him saying dummy. It was him saying all kinds of naughty things.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, I kind of grew up with stand-up comedy. So it's been a big integral part of my life, which is probably why I'm such a cut-up now as an adult.
Right. And I was always known as kind of a cut-up in class, too, and kind of the funny guy in class.
I find it hard to believe.
Right, for sure. Everywhere I go, I'm kind of the comedian of the group, maybe me and a couple other people, but I'm normally considered the comedian of the group. And part of that was growing up Generation X and really kind of, I think, comedy coming into its own. Obviously in the 60s you had it, but I really think by the time you hit the 70s, you really have stand-up routines kind of being down and packed and people actually being comedians. I mean, you can go before that and talk about Lenny Bruce and stuff like that. But I mean, really, I grew up listening to comedy. I grew up listening to stand-up comedy is what we're talking about, not just, comedy shows, but stand-up comedians all the way from George Carlin to Eddie Murphy Raw, all the way into the 90s, when you started having the advent of Comedy Central, which was originally called the HA Network, and then it's called Comedy Central. And you turned on Comedy Central, and really everything that was on, like most all day, was stand-up comedy. I mean, it was pretty much all that was on. So for me, it really started back as early as I can remember. And the first stand-up comedian I remember watching as a kid would have come down to a handful of different people. I don't know if I can remember the very first, but it was on HBO and then tapes too, by the way, and it would have been like Howie Mandel and George Carlin. I remember the two first. Even Richard Pryor was one of the first ones I remember listening to. I didn't watch it. I got to listen to Richard Pryor, and it was shortly after he burned himself, I think in '83, and he was making jokes about that. Stand-up comedy is such an influence on us Generation Xers. What's your earliest memory of stand-up comedy, and how do you think it affected us as we were growing up?
Well, that's an excellent question. And of course, I remember comedians from way back. And of course, usually you'd see them as a guest on like the Mike Douglas show or whatever. I remember being a kid and wanting to stay up late to watch the Flip Wilson show. But the thing of it was, most of it went right over my head. So I'm going to actually go back to the time when I not only heard them and laugh because they were talking funny, but when I actually started to understand the humor and actually sort of grok what they were, when I was empathizing with them. And I'm going to go back to, I'd say Steve Martin.
Oh
I'd say
yeah.
Steve Martin, probably the late 70s. He had an album, I believe it was called Comedy Isn't Pretty. And a kid I went to summer camp with, because, remember we had our boom boxes. Somebody had it on cassette tape, and like during like lunch period or whatever, or just downtime, we would play that, and it was like the funniest thing because he was remarkably approachable, even to a bunch of 12, 13 year olds, and just he had a way of carrying you along in his comedy. Of course, one of the things he's best remembered for, before he started doing movies, was the song his grandma used to sing, "Be obsequious, purple, and clairvoyant," and he could
Yeah.
actually get an entire lounge full of people to sing this very irrelevant song with him. He could really bring a whole audience along, and I think that's one of the more important things for comedians to have, not just be funny, that of course is number one, but to actually develop a rapport with their audience and bring them along so people really feel that they're having an experience. So I'm going to go with Steve Martin as my initial experience in
Yeah,
comedy.
I love Steve Martin. He was great. He still is great. I haven't seen him do any stand up for a long time. I don't think he does that anymore, but I do remember that. But I saw that in retrospect. I saw that later on after it was already filmed. I think there is a big turn toward the bizarre in comedy, the uh, the theatrics in comedy, because now we have television, and now comedy's on television. It's not just in nightclubs anymore or just on radio or whatever, but what's a special going to look like? And some people really crashed and burned when it came to that, and some people really excelled when it came to that. Like I said, I'm a huge fan of stand-up comedy, and Steve Martin was definitely one of them. The other thing that happened with us as Generation Xers is we're really sarcastic. That kind of, I think, more sarcastic than the previous generation for sure. That sarcasm type of comedy, and it has to do. I think personally, it has to do with the kind of being let down a lot. Being let down a lot, and growing up with the ever expanding broken homes and things like that, and uh, taking care of
Huge.
yourself, and more bullying
Latchkey
people.
kids.
Yeah, more, and so there,
Mhm.
for someone like me who is a relative geek, a relative nerd, I mean, sarcasm and comedy was a way to protect myself. You know what I mean? And so I'd listen to these guys, and then I'd try to emulate them in my own life. Now you mentioned too. Now, so Steve Martin was definitely right there at the beginning of. I think it's kind of hard to pin when it gets big. You know what I mean? It's like obviously there were comedians before that, but like you were saying, they're like 5 minutes on a show or whatever. Or if they had an album, like could you find it even? Was it anywhere? But suddenly it started getting everywhere. It started getting big. People started having their albums and buying their albums. Go ahead.
And you know what it really kicked off? I believe, if I remember correctly, HBO and the home film channels. One of the things they used to do to flesh out their content would be to carry these sometimes Broadway specials
Right.
and present them to you. And the first one of those I remember specifically was the Robin Williams, God rest, his first HBO special. Now, prior to that, comedy was usually done in these 5 to 7 minute blurbs. Again, on late night TV, I remember for years, one of the things I remember uh, looking forward to every week on SNL, they used to have a stand-up comedian of the week. To the MST3K fans out there, um, Joel was one of their perennials. He actually did a number of appearances. In fact, I knew him before MST3K for his appearance on SNL. But with the HBO, you could take an entire 90-minute, 2-hour special and just present it to the entire country.
Yeah.
So it wasn't just people lucky enough to get the ticket or clever enough to buy the album afterwards. They could see it almost in real time, even though it was filmed beforehand. And again, Robin Williams doing an entire 2 hour, and of course, he climbs the walls literally.
Yeah.
And you mentioned it going from a simply an audio to a visual format. He really presented. He didn't just do a stand-up comedy routine. He was doing live theater.
Yeah.
And I think that actually was a game changer in American stand-up comedy.
Yeah, I do too. I do too. Some of the things that happened with comedy back then when you started getting albums is then that didn't come across as well. But I do remember on HBO, I do remember that on HBO watching Robin Williams, because HBO was one of those things, like they were hard to find programming to do. So for example, like I can't tell you how many times I saw the movie Tank, or you know what I mean? They playing these movies
Jenny
over.
Lee Harrison had a crush on her.
Oh yeah, and the Robin Williams one, and then there was the Robert Klein. Is that his name? Robert Klein. He did. I think he was one of the earliest ones to come on HBO, and it might have even been the first thing ever shown on HBO. I'm not sure. I could be wrong about that, but I think, yeah,
that's ringing a bell. I saw it with my mom when I was like 13 because she loved Robert Klein. So I do remember watching it. And it may have, or at least it may have been their first event, like not just feature film. It was their first presentation, shall we say, maybe.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting is you have this theatric thing, and nobody knows, how that's going to. It's being filmed now and being shown on TV, and no one really knows how well that's going to last. Everybody thinks that's going to last forever. And you have like two kinds of comedians, at least the kind of comedian that embellishes that, and then the kind of comedian that still that might dabble in it, but still focus more on the fact that it's an oration, that it's auditory, and it comes across better as jokes are concerned. And some people did it so much, this live thing so much, that it actually backfired on them. For example, Steve, the guy or whatever, what's his name? Steve Goldberg? No, is it? No.
I know what you're talking about. It's on the tip of my tongue.
It is on the tip of my tongue too, but he didn't.
It's going to drive me nuts. But we'll put a pin in that. We'll get back to it. But that guy.
Yeah, it didn't go. It didn't. I mean, that was one of those things that kind of niche comedy like that was really popular, but got really outdated quickly. I mean, he's still big in the comedy circuit. He does stuff on Bigfoot now and things like that. He's been on the Joe Rogan podcast, and he was helping a lot of comedians back then. But
I saw Joe Rogan when he was doing the comedy circuit years ago. He was doing the college.
You did?
Comedy circuit when I was in college. He zinged me, actually.
Oh, really?
He actually. Yeah. He, of course, he's doing that thing where he asks the audience a question and they don't realize it's a trap. And he goes, "Any fraternity brothers out there?" And I said, "Yes." And he goes, "Which one?" And I go, "Kappa Delta Phi." And he goes, "What's that, a fungus?" And then immediately moved on. So yes, I actually got zinged by Joe Rogan, and was happy to have been zinged. It was nice to be part of the set. Yeah,
it was nice. And the way, so like for another one was Yakov Smirnoff. You know what I mean? Like there's only so many jokes you can tell about being foreign and have a very thick accent. It was funny for a while, but after a while it stopped being funny. And the way you could kind of tell was how much of the joke you got on audio only. So if you couldn't watch it, and you're only listening to the audio, you're like, well, it just doesn't come across as well. The jokes aren't as funny if you don't see them. Where someone like George Carlin is super funny live, but you can listen to him too. It's all about the oration. It's all about the timing and the actual material, and not necessarily about the antics or something like that. Which one did you like better? Did you like the antic people, or did you did you like the
Um, well,
auditory?
I'll put it this way. I it would depend on what my mood is for. Sometimes an antic comic, as you pros, could be a lot of fun. But I think all things considered, I preferred the oration. But
Yeah.
one thing they all had was a gimmick. And you hit the nail on the head with Yakov Smirnoff. His gimmick was that he was from the other side of the Iron Curtain, which was very, very topical
Yeah.
to us Gen X kids. Now, here's the funny thing, and Ben Stiller actually, when in his short-lived sketch comedy show,
Yeah. Yeah.
the Ben Stiller show, he actually did a whole thing on that about how, with the end of the Cold War, Yakov Smirnoff now had no material,
Yes, I
and
remember that. I do remember that.
no
Yeah.
folks, and what a country, and it's like, sorry, it's not topical anymore, and sadly, there went his career. Oddly enough, Yakov Smirnoff, and I'm sure you may remember this, he got his big break on American television. He had a recurring character on Night Court
Yes.
as as a foreign person who keeps getting into some kind of wacky trouble and having to talk his way out of it. With another stand-up comedian as a star, Harry Anderson. Now, Harry Anderson, he was a gimmick comic as well. He was a magician who also told jokes. But the great thing about him was, if you removed all the magic from his act, you still had a great act.
Yeah.
So I think what I'm trying to say is, you do in fact need a gimmick to really break through, but it can't solely be about the gimmick. You have to actually have a strong comedic sense as well. So
Yeah.
I think the two just went together. Well, it's like, take for example the shock comics, which we've been strangely omitting to this point, and I'm not going to champion them or condemn them. One thing I will say is, and was it Richard Pryor who did the whole bit about this? The acid test is, if you take all the, shall we say, filth out of
Uh-huh.
the act, is it
Yeah.
still funny?
Yeah.
If
Right.
it is, they're successful. If
Right.
it's not, they're just saying raunchy things, and they're not really comedians. They're just shock jocks.
Yeah. Yeah. I get that too. That kind of bugged me actually. I mean, I don't mind cursing in comedy. It's okay. I'm not like going to turn it off if I hear the F bomb or something like that. That's not who I am. But I want it to be funny. You know what I mean? I don't want it just to be, oh, that's he's saying something outlandish or whatever. And there was some of that going on. And I know that for me, again, I say things that people get upset about. I loved George Carlin. I thought he was hilarious, and he had lots of
He's my
cursing
favorite.
in comedy. But one person who had lots of cursing in comedy that I didn't find funny at all was Richard Pryor.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't listened to him in a long time, but it's just I mean, if you can delete half of your act by just removing the F word, then uh, and I know that I'm in the minority. I know that I'm in the minority. That's like when I last night or the other day when I said that I thought that the book of Lord of the Rings was better than the movie, or the movie is better than the book. I know that's like sacrilege, and I know that saying Richard Pryor wasn't funny. It's not that he wasn't entertaining. It's just that when I watched him or listened to him, I didn't laugh. I didn't laugh out loud. I didn't belly roll. But I listened to George Carlin, and I mean, I can't stop laughing. Even his stuff that's not, kid friendly, 7 words you can't say on TV. And then he did the whole which drug the seven dwarves were on, sleepy, dopey.
Yeah.
That was hilarious. And another comedian that I really, so you really like George Carlin too. You were a big fan of his.
He was probably my personal favorite. If I had to whittle him down to one comedian, I'd probably end up with George Carlin.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes. So yes, he's
For
my
me,
favorite.
it's very time sensitive period. I mean, for me during the 80s, probably 70s, but I mean, I was listening to this stuff in the 80s. Like I was starting to listen to it in like 84, 85, 84. I was listening to it. Watching Howie Mandel on you not YouTube. Howie Mandel on YouTube in 84. Watching Howie Mandel on HBO and Kevin Kline on HBO, and then the young comedian specials on
Robert
HBO.
Klein.
Oh, Robert Klein. Who did I say?
Robert Klein.
Who did I?
Kevin Klein.
Oh,
He
Kevin
was in the
Kline.
Big Chill.
Yeah,
He's
yeah.
married to Phoebe Cates. Lucky dog.
different, different guy altogether. Yeah.
Different actor.
Um, I was going somewhere and I totally forgot where I was going with that. Oh, but for
It's
the
just you like different comedians in different periods.
yeah, the 80s for sure. I was definitely a George Carlin fan. I had lots of his stuff, lots of it. I mean, I had A Place for My Stuff. I had um, What Am I Doing in New Jersey? All right, what else did I have? I had tons. I had tons. I was a huge, huge George Carlin fan back then. What was your favorite? What was some of your favorite bits back then of
Oh,
his?
by George Carlin?
Sure, sure.
Well, he, as many of you know, he was the host of the first Saturday Night Live,
Yes.
and he actually did a whole bit on religion, where he talked about it was like wearing somebody else's shoes,
Right.
and he says, "I understand how you know." Much like wearing shoes, religion can give you a lift. It can make your day easier, but don't make somebody else wear your shoes. And it was a very nice way of saying, um, you can have religion, but not proselytize people. And that is such a polarized powder keg, really, that the fact that he could actually handle it in a humorous and not an antagonistic way, I thought was very, very nice. Usually comedians like to bash on religion. He didn't. He basically told it nicely to stay off his feet, I guess you'd
Right,
say.
right, right.
Um, and of course, the 7 words you can't say on television was huge. But then, of course, he amended that to 10, and then he actually ended he ended one of his HBO specials with every single word you couldn't say on television, and it was a scroll, and he read them during the credits, and it
Yeah,
just went on, and I won't do it here. I won't even
yeah,
pretend to do it, but it went on,
right.
and I just thought he was hilarious. One of the weird things was when they tried to give him his own show. I thought that was less effective. Um, and I remember Peter Marshall, which you may remember, he was the original host of Hollywood Squares. When people asked him why Paul Lynde, speaking of stand-up comedians, while he never like really, while his shows never worked or really became like a megastar, he said he was like creme brulee. People enjoyed him in smaller doses.
Hmm.
If you tried to eat a big bowl of it, it was too much. And I think I've used this analogy before and other things. So I'm using it again now. And I think that was the thing with George Carlin. When George Carlin came out and did like a set or had a supporting role in a movie, he was phenomenal. But
Yeah.
when you try to make him the centerpiece, it
Was
got a little much.
was that on Fox? Was that on Fox?
Yes, he had a show on Fox.
I do remember that. I do remember going, oh, and I'm not sure I don't know if I've ever seen except for maybe the first episode of it or something like that. But I do remember that. And I
It
do
wasn't
remember,
especially funny, you
yeah,
know. It
yeah,
wasn't bad, but it wasn't. I expected to like have my sides hurt at the end,
yeah.
and it wasn't.
Well,
But
in my
say it
opinion
there.
too, I mean, really George Carlin kind of peaked with What Am I Doing in New Jersey? After What Am I Doing in New Jersey, there was really only one set that he did that I really loved, and that was in, I think it was in '03, where they did a tribute to George Carlin with Jon Stewart. I don't know if you saw that or not. And
No, I'm sorry, I
he
missed
did
it.
a set on there that was pretty funny. But I mean, really, everything after What Am I Doing in New Jersey was just just to me was just a mean rant, just him ranting. It wasn't funny. It really wasn't. There were some clever things in there, but clever is not always funny. It's as insightful, but insightful is not always funny. Um,
He had a similar fate to Lenny Bruce, where the angrier they got, the less funnier they became. I had a very similar experience. I saw Sam Kinison only months before he passed on.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking, I mean, he put on a good show and he put in a lot of effort. And some of his bits were very funny, but it was really just him being angry at the world.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I'm sorry, I came here to laugh, not find out about how horrible everything is. And again, sometimes comedy, because of course, there's the old credo, comedy is pain plus time. Normally, some of your funniest comedians have very tragic lives,
Yeah.
and their comedy is the way they cope with it, which we touched on earlier. But I think some of those folks sometimes succumb to their anger, and unfortunately, too much rage destroys the comedy. It's like pressure creates diamonds,
Yeah.
and it can also crush them.
Well, and here's the thing too. So, I totally agree with that. And that for me, that happened with George Carlin. He just
Mhm.
stopped getting funny and just started getting angry. These angry rants. Um, so you get George Carlin and these people who were part of the development of comedy to be what it was, and then you had people coming on the scene in the '80s who like exploded on the scene. So Eddie Murphy, Andrew Dice Clay, and Sam Kinison. They were people. And by the way, back in the '80s, I was a teenager. Well, I was a preteen and teen. Okay, so preteen and teen. Is that on your end?
Yeah, the airplane is going overhead. It should be gone in
Oh,
a couple
okay. All
seconds.
right. I was like, oh, you getting bombed? Whatever. So,
I hope not.
um, uh, but yeah, like 85, 86 or somewhere around there when I started listening to this stuff. I was in my rebellious years. So I was definitely listening to some things that I would not have been approved of by my parents. And of course, one of them was Sam Kinison, Andrew Dice Clay, and of course George Carlin. But the people who exploded on the scene, that these people laid the foundation for this scene, and then you have these people exploding on the scene. And Eddie Murphy, Raw was, well, and the one before that, Delirious, was
Hilarious.
was hilarious. And then he had an album before that wasn't, I don't think it was on video, but it was an album before that where he talks about getting his being knocked out and people coming over and stealing his shoes. Do you remember that?
I'm trying to remember the name of it to save my life because, yeah, my best friend had it
It was before
and he used to play it all the
Delirious,
time.
and then before
Yes.
Delirious, and then Raw, and then
That wasn't a self-titled album. It wasn't just Eddie Murphy, was
might
it?
have been. It might have been.
Because I'm drawing a blank, but I know the exact album you're talking about. Yes.
That was
Yeah. In
hilarious.
fact, he even made me a gypsy tape of it, where I had a tape-to-tape player on my stereo, and I made a copy of it. So yes, I did have it, but I can't think of the name to save my life right now.
Yeah,
So,
right.
and
So
yeah, Eddie Murphy was definitely a game changer. He
okay,
started out as in that disastrous replacement cast of SNL.
yeah,
Um, and actually, personally, I think he saved SNL, to be honest with you, because it was, well, Joe Piscopo helped, but it was
yes,
really Eddie Murphy. People tuned back in to see him and his
yep.
characters and just him chew the scenery and Mr. Robert's neighborhood and all that. And
And
then
Gumby
we went,
and
oh,
Gumby and
and
yes,
damn it. Yes, just priceless material. His early movies, before Beverly Hills Cop, I love Beverly Hills Cop. Still one of my favorites. We talked about that with our soundtracks, remember? So, but even his movies that weren't particularly great were a lot of fun. So he was really a game changer. He was TV, he was big screen, and he was comedy. He was a triple threat,
yeah,
and he really was. If you had to pick one person to represent comedy in the '80s, I would have had to say Eddie Murphy.
yeah. He was one of my favorite, and then he didn't do it. He hasn't done any stand up comedy after Raw, has he?
Um, Apart from a few award ceremonies, well, he'll do a small stick. No, he was talking about it. He actually, and this, my wife and I were just talking about this. He actually went on to do Disney films. The
Yeah,
man who at one time in his life had a rated X film, was it Raw or Delirious that was actually rated X, or both of them actually? But one of them they had to be altered. It was rated X when it first came out.
oh
But then he
wow,
went on to do Doctor Doolittle,
yeah,
and,
right. He makes too
and he
much
gave
money doing that. He doesn't need to be thinking about stand up comedy and stuff like that. So, I mean, these people kind of exploded, game changers, shocking. Andrew Dice Clay was shocking. He did his little, his
The nursery
nursery
rhymes.
rhymes, and got booted off of MTV permanently. I don't know if you remember that. Yeah, he got.
Vividly,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, what happened was on the MTV thing is they kept he was going to be on the MTV Music Awards, and he was going to have to be on TV, and it was going to be so it was going to have to be clean. But you can kind of retool your comedy to make it clean, and he certainly was going to. But what happened was, as they kept cutting him, they kept saying, well, this is running long. So instead of 5 minutes, we're going to give you 4 minutes. And this is going to run long. So instead of 4 minutes, we're going to give you 3 minutes. And then it kept cutting him. And then finally he just got fed up, and he just went out there and started cursing up a storm and telling the dirtiest jokes there were, kind of in protest. And then they said, okay, you can't be on MTV. You're banned for life on MTV. But what's interesting about him is he was just a character. He was just a character. He wasn't, that's not who he really is. That was a character act that he got pigeonholed into, much like, the blue collar guy. What's Larry the Cable Guy? Much like Larry the Cable Guy, that was a character that he did. And I don't know if you remember the Unknown comic. Do you remember him?
Yes.
Okay.
From the Gong Show.
Yeah.
The Gong Show,
he
yes.
he had a movie. What's the name of that dang movie? This is one of those things you're supposed to look up before you start a podcast on it. It's called Crazy
The Unknown
Nights.
Movie.
Huh?
The Unknown Movie.
Yeah, it was called Crazy Nights or something like that. And Andrew Dice Clay makes an appearance in that movie, and he tells a joke in that movie. Yeah,
really?
Yeah, he does. He's sitting there on the street, and he tells he goes, I'm not going to repeat the curse words, but he's like, why'd the effing monkey fall out of the effing tree? It was because he was effing dead. And anyway, it was just like a real small role that he played in that, but it was with the Unknown comic. That was a pretty raunchy show. One of those, 80s or 70s, late 70s raunchy shows. I know him, and I loved Sam Kinison too. I was fans.
I saw him live.
Yeah, you said you saw him live. Was that later in his career though? Was he more angry at that time or something?
Yeah, sadly, that was literally months before he was in that fatal car crash. God rest.
Yeah. But I thought he was funny too. I thought he was funny as well. What are some, before we move on to the 90s, what are some of the more unknown comics or more flubs or things like that maybe comics that were funny but didn't go as far as other people would have, or maybe as far as they should have? What comes to mind when you think of that?
Usually, and I don't want to point fingers, a lot of times they usually make some tragic mistake. Comedy has to be fresh. It has to be topical. So usually what the comedians have to do is they have to push the envelope. And sometimes when you push the envelope, you go just a little bit too far. And then it's like the old game, don't break the ice. Once the ice is broken, then you can't pick up all the pieces and you're out. The classic example, speaking of George Carlin, being angry, I'll never forget, I was listening to him, and he was doing a set, and it was in New York, and we all know how much George Carlin loved New York City, so I'm not condemning him for this or even chastising him, but he decided that he was going to a joke where he was talking about the curtailment of freedom that had come in the post 9/11 society. And I don't want to misquote him, but the gist of what he was saying is he found the loss of personal freedom less troubling than planes crashing into buildings. And you could tell there was like a hush that went over the crowd. Yeah. And they were like, no, not cool. And he was like, no, you understand what I'm getting at. And they're like, no, we do understand what you're getting at. No, it's not cool. And now it did not kill his career. But I think a lot of people realized the same realization you did at that point, that he's kind of gone off the rails. He went from the angry young man to the crazy old man.
Yeah.
And, And of course, Gilbert Gottfried the guy you were trying to think of earlier?
No, I was thinking of Bobcat Goldthwait. I remember
Bobcat Goldthwait. Okay, because they both had
Bobcat.
screamy voices.
Yeah, they
Goldthwait.
did both. I was actually thinking of the other there like right before you were saying it, but somebody like that's kind of like one of those things. It's like it was funny at the time, and it just doesn't have lasting power. It just doesn't. I mean, nobody wants to listen to Bobcat Goldthwait except for
Gives you a
me.
headache.
In retrospect, it just doesn't survive. And then some of these people who did this too in the 90s, who kind of had character actor pieces like emo and that Julie girl with the accordion was
Julie
oh
Tenuta.
yeah
Julie Tenuta.
it's
Who did the
funny
commercial
at
for Shasta for a while.
what's that.
She did commercials for Shasta Cola for a while.
Yeah,
Shasta Soda.
it's too indicative of the time that it doesn't nobody wants to go and listen to that anymore. To me, look, I'm not trying to be negative. Everybody's got to try to do what they want to do, and you know, you raise your flag and you see who salutes it. But unfortunately, for the most part, yeah, that was funny at that time, and it's not funny. Where somebody like, well, let's think of a long-lasting comedian. Well, in the 90s, a long-lasting comedian was like Brian Regan. I mean, Brian Regan is one of my all-time favorite comedians, and he's still funny. I mean, it's long, it's not character piece. You know what I mean? It's not, I don't even know. Yeah, it's just not character piece. So I don't know if I'm saying that right. You know what I'm saying?
I think I know what you're driving at. And certainly one of the things about the late '80s and early '90s is it seems the novelty of a lot of things wore off. Things that we thought were going to be a long term part of the zeitgeist. I hate to use that
Yes.
cliche,
Yeah.
but were really a flash. They were really more of a flash in the pan. They
Yeah.
were just a fad. And if you watch things from the '90s, you'll see that. In fact, what was his name? He died not too long ago. Gary Shandling. Remember the Gary Shandling
Oh
show?
yeah, yeah, yeah. I loved it. Loved Gary Shandling show.
He did a show once where part of the shtick was he was skipping ahead 2 years to answer some question. Well, it'll take a couple of years to find out. Okay, so he skips ahead a couple of years, and so now it's the '90s, and all of a sudden everyone's wearing turtlenecks and shorts. And he goes, because this is the '90s, everyone wears turtlenecks and shorts. He goes the rest of the show where everyone's wearing turtlenecks and shorts, when in reality things in the '90s were such a flash in the pan. Like, remember baggy pants turn around backwards?
Oh yeah,
And
yeah.
everyone thought that was going to be a long-term thing. And it was like, that lasted for like a summer.
Yep.
And then people stopped doing it.
Yeah, for sure. Yes, I do
You
remember that.
know, so I think a lot of the comedians, a lot of their shtick, I
Yeah,
think it just got old real fast.
it's
I mean,
super
and
old.
emo, I'm going to get the name. It's Emo Williams, right?
Yeah,
The guy who talk like this. And some of the stuff was actually really, really funny. But again, it got old real fast, which is why I think he sort of fell off the face of the earth. The last thing I saw him in was a few years ago. He was doing one of those micro comedy shows on Adult Swim,
uh-huh.
where it was supposed to be like a modern day Three Stooges type situation. And it was funny, but I'm like, oh my God, is that emo? And I hadn't thought of him in 25 years.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
don't mean to laugh, but he's still around. But again, his niche was very easily filled, I'm afraid.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you don't know, and then back then you don't know what's going to last and what's not going to last, and you just do something you think's gonna last. It's like investing in parachute pants, It's just like, oh man, this is gonna be the best. We're gonna be wearing these for years, and then yeah, you wear them maybe 1 year, and then they're gone. Yeah, comedians of the '80s, really, in my mind, the names that come up to me are Eddie Murphy, Andrew Dice Clay, and Sam Kinison. Those are the names that kind of
Definitely.
stick out for me. Comedians of the '70s that I was listening to in the '80s, of course, are Richard Pryor, George Carlin, and Robin Williams, and Steve Martin, and things like that. Um, some people who kind of bridged it kind of a little bit both sides, but did pretty good. Howie Mandel, I think did okay in the 80s. He was pretty popular in the 80s. He did a little bit of the antics, but his material was funny enough that you could listen to him, and you didn't miss it a whole lot. But then you get into the 90s. And in the 90s, we actually started getting, like I said, the Comedy Central, where people can get exposed more. It's not just you have to have HBO and wait for the special. It's comedy all day long. I mean, really, it's comedy all day long. And you have breakout stars that came as a result, and shows that came as a result of that. And I think one of the breakout stars that came during the 90s was Brian Regan. Clean comedian, but funny. I mean, just absolutely, and still funny. I mean, he just had a comedy show on Netflix not too long ago, maybe released like 6 months ago at the most. I loved him. More sarcastic comedians starting to come out. People like David Spade. His comedy was real. I'm a huge David Spade fan, as people know about this. I mean, I loved his stand-up comedy routines. I thought they were hilarious.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So when you think of 90s, what do you think of 90s stand-up comedy? Who comes to your mind, and what do you think of differences between the 80s and 90s and that?
Well, when I think of 90s comedians, the first thing that always pops into my head is Penn and Teller.
Oh yeah, okay.
And which is funny because you mentioned Comedy Central and now All Comedy All the Time Network. They were actually the de facto hosts of it in its early days, which is probably why I associate the two. But again, they had a gimmick. They were a magic act as well as a comedy act. One guy was the impresario. The other guy never said a word while on stage. Now, a lot of you are probably saying they actually started the 80s. And yes, I know that. But for some reason, I think they sort of, I wouldn't say peaked in the 90s, but they reached their high water mark.
They exploded in the 90s for sure. Yeah,
exactly.
I mean, even Brian Regan started in the 80s, but he exploded in the 90s, And I think like Eddie Murphy probably started in the 70s, but exploded in the 80s. It's just a matter of when they kind of, hit their stride. So I'm with you on Penn and Teller. And let me just say too, shtick acts can be good if you have something long lasting. Like, for example, that magic thing. We all know that magic has a long lasting, history behind it. So if you put magic and comedy together, the likelihood that people will get tired of that isn't as likely. It is just, to me, it isn't as likely. That's why they've stuck around so much. But yeah, Penn and Teller were hilarious. Gross.
They were amazing.
Yeah.
And I always thought a lot of the reason people watched them was because they kept waiting for Teller to say something. Like, people watch Frasier because they want to see Lilith.
Yeah.
Or they watch Home Improvement because they want the neighbor to stick his head over the fence. I think people sooner or later he's got to talk. And of course, in their one and only feature film, Teller does talk at the end.
What film
I
is
also
that?
have the honor. The movie's called Penn and Teller Get Killed, which is I think 91.
Yeah.
And it's sort of a spy spoof stalker movie. They work their comedy into the movie, and it's almost like a series of vignettes. Mm-hmm. It's not bad. It wasn't particularly good, and it wasn't particularly well marketed, so it didn't do really well in the box office. But it's called Penn and Teller Gets Killed, and if you haven't seen it, check it out.
Yeah.
I actually got to talk to Teller. I saw them live in Boston in probably 98, 99, around there, and I was getting autographs, and I was getting Teller's autograph, and I go, I've been trying to see you guys for 10 years now. And he goes, well, don't let it be 10 years before you see us again. And he gives me the autograph, and I go, I talked to Teller. Right. No one will believe me.
That's awesome.
So, little anecdote I got there.
I never got to meet I don't think I've ever gotten to meet any famous comedians, unfortunately. I wish maybe this will be an avenue to meet some of them, but no, I did not get to meet any of them, unfortunately.
I get to meet Tom Kenny too.
You got to meet who?
Tom Kenny. otherwise known in this day and age as the voice of SpongeBob.
Oh.
Believe it or not, he got his start as a stand-up comedian.
Ah.
And he was doing the college circuit back in the day, and he came to my college, and I saw him do a pub show with maybe 30 kids in it. And at the end of the show, it was weird because do you remember, speaking of the 80s and the comedy renaissance, do you remember Carolyn's Comedy Hour?
No,
It
I
was a
don't.
weekly show. It was a weekly show where they would spotlight up and coming comedians, and he did a set on that. And I just happened to catch him the next week in my college. And as he was leaving, I go, "Hey, you were great on Carolyn's Comedy Hour last week." And he stopped, and he's like, "You saw that?" Like he was amazed that people actually knew he was. And I go, "Oh yeah, you were great." And he actually stopped and chatted with me for a while. And he's like,
Yeah.
"Keep watching." Now, of course, he later went on to much bigger fame. He does the voice of SpongeBob. He also does a lot of voices on Comedy Central. He's on my favorite Comedy Central show, Rick and Morty. He
Yeah.
does voices for that too. So yeah.
Oh.
So those are my biggie meet and greets. I
Yeah.
haven't met a lot of others, but those are my biggies.
Yeah, my biggies are would definitely be those guys as well. I mean, yeah, they were on Comedy Central a lot. You had those shows were constantly they were constantly, pushing out shows in which you get these 5 minute clips of different comedians, and then the hour clips, and then specials and stuff like that, and then the half-hour specials and things like that. Um, One of my favorite shows, and actually he was a really good comedian, was the Dr. Katz, the therapist show, Jonathan Katz. Now I don't know if you got to see his show. Was funny where he had a bunch of people on there. And you can talk about their comedy all day long. One of the comedians that were on there was just fantastic. Was Dom Iorera. I think he is so funny. Dom Iorera is just hilarious.
I can visualize it, but I'm trying to think of one of his jokes just for like
Uh,
but I think I know
he
you're
does
talking
he
about.
does the he does very sarcastic humor where he's like, oh, I'm feeling sick, everybody thinks they're a doctor. He says, well, drink plenty of fluids and get rest. He's like, well, thanks a lot. He's an Italian guy. He's like, oh, thanks a lot, I thought I was going to go run a marathon. And it's like I
Yeah, yeah,
really
he always
appreciate
does
that.
that sort of he plays that sort of angry city guy who always like
Yeah.
knows everything about everything. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay, yes, I knew I could
He's
place him.
he's hilarious. But Dr. Katz, or Jonathan Katz, he's not really a doctor. Jonathan Katz was hilarious on there as a comedian. In his show, Dr. Katz. Did you get a chance to watch Dr. Katz?
I watched the cartoon, that Squiggle Vision with
Yes.
John H. Benjamin did the voice of his slacker son,
Yep.
and yeah, I do remember that show vividly. That was huge in the '90s.
Yeah, it was big. It was really big. And then they had a show with I think I can't remember who the guy was, but it was but this is where the first time I ever saw Ellen, and when she was back doing comedy, stand-up comedy, not just her show, but back doing on the circuit. But it was a show, it was like a late night show, but it was only about comedians that were on there, and I can't remember the name of the show. But speaking of Ellen, we haven't even touched on female comedians because they started to explode in the 90s as well. They got it, they got their voice. I don't I'm trying to even think of a comedian in the 80s that was a female comedian, but you might remind me. Go ahead if you have one. But
One of my favorites, who actually got her start in the '60s. She was actually in the first wave, I guess you'd say. Joan Rivers.
oh yeah, yeah, Joan Rivers. Yeah, she was
Joan Rivers,
hilarious.
and she exploded the '80s, with like she actually briefly had her own show. In fact, that's the reason she and Johnny Carson had a falling out.
Yep.
Rather than become his permanent assistant, she became his rival, and she didn't tell him in advance, and he was very heartbroken. But I actually, I have an anecdote for everything. I have a Joan Rivers anecdote,
Go ahead.
if you'll indulge me. This is back in the '80s. I was a kid. I was probably 15, 16, and there's a venue down there. I won't say which one it is because it's still in operation, and I'm not a shill. But anyway, there was a venue, and it used to be they call it an open air event. That is to say, they didn't have people working the gates. You buy your ticket, it would be on the honor system, and you would just filter in, right? Well, what people were doing I found this out through friends of mine, was well, you would just sort of saunter in right before the show, because there would always be a few open seats. Right before the show, um, you would notice which seats weren't taken and very discreetly blah, blah, and plop yourself down like that was your seat the whole time. You were just meandering about talking to people and whatever. And my mother, who was straight as an arrow, never did anything naughty in her life. I tried to talk her into doing it, and her friends already had tickets. It's like, no, you and your son come on down, and there'll be extra seats. You guys just take extra seats. No, I don't do that. That would be wrong. That would be wrong. No, they don't care. There's empty seats. Who cares? Who cares? And we finally got my mother into doing it. Well, apparently the word had got out that this shenanigan had been happening, and like 15 people, gate attendants, walk up to us. Excuse me, sir, ma'am, may I see your ticket? And we're like, and I go into my Casablanca routine. Oh, my papers! I must have forgotten my papers. And okay, no ticket. You'll have to leave. And the problem was we couldn't leave because we were the ride for the other people who had tickets. So we sat in the parking lot. They let us stay in the parking lot. They didn't care. We sat in the parking lot, and we got to listen to Joan Rivers' entire act, and she was very, very, very funny. So
I don't even
Okay.
remember her act. Maybe only a couple of like lines here and there, maybe on Johnny Carson or something like that. But I mean, the '90s women exploded, and she probably paved the way for that. I mean, you had Elaine Boozler, you had, like I said, Ellen, and a number of female acts who came out, and I thought, see, Ellen was hilarious. I mean, she was hilarious as far as a stand-up routine is concerned. I loved her act, like her act where she'd kind of like lead you in one direction and then go another direction, like entirely. Like you're not even thinking that she's going to be talking about this, then go somewhere else entirely. She'd bring out a guitar sometimes, then she'd just like, well, I don't play it, but I like to pound on the back of it. Like she was one of the best. She's probably still is. She just doesn't do it anymore. But as far as stand-up comedians, as far as female stand-up comedians is concerned, she's certainly was the cream of the crop. Yeah, there were some other ones. They just kind of, some women out there. Paula Poundstone, I thought she was hilarious, very hilarious girl. The problem was I found that a lot of the ladies were just kind of man hating, kind of thing, and I didn't care for that to some degree. I was like, oh, okay, except for one, and I loved her even when she did it, and that was Roseanne Barr. I thought her stand up, and even when she talked mean about men, I thought it was hilarious. I couldn't stop.
Really, Roseanne? You like Roseanne?
I loved Roseanne. I loved her stand. I would die laughing when it came to Roseanne. Did you not like her?
I know she's say anything mean about anyone, but let's just say she wasn't one of my favorites.
Okay, all right.
I found her to be just. I mean, I thought her bits were actually very funny, but I just found her personally to be very abrasive.
Yes,
like her voice on Dan. Yeah. It was like nails on a blackboard. You know what I think it was? She reminded me vividly of an old friend of my mother's, and so I think it was a negative association. I think because I kept thinking of her as this Linda person. I'm like, so maybe I never gave her a fair shot. I will tell you, she was she was a game changer, because again, you didn't see all of that whole working class from a female perspective. Most of the comedians at the time were they talked about their college experiences, and it was a different status of humor.
Right.
Roseanne always had her roots with the working class, so that much I'll give you. She brought a new approach to female comedy.
Yeah, well, and I loved her show too. I mean, her show for me changed a lot of stuff. But one of the things about television shows, and I'll bring this back to comedy because I kind of want to talk about today's comedians and like what comedians were excited about now. But one of the things her show did that a lot of people didn't do. Let me back up here, not mess up my words. Hollywood, even in television shows, is not in touch with reality. And you can see this best in the jobs everybody has. Everybody has some high corporate office job, or they're a DJ, or they're, nobody's a working class person. But, all my friends were all working class people. I was a working class person. It's, and Roseanne exploded on there, and the parents weren't the leaders at PBS, or a psychologist, or he was a construction worker and a mechanic. And I just think that struck a chord with a lot of people, in my opinion. And that's really one of the ways that I think that Hollywood is out of touch, that you can see it anyway with the common person. I mean, we still watch those shows. They're still funny. But none of my friends' parents were lawyers or psychologists. There was not to say that there weren't people like that. It just was far and few between. But I mean, if you look at TV, it's like everybody's parent was worked at PBS, or worked in television, or had this high paying job or something like that. And that was far and few between in my life. In my life, most people were either waitresses or waiters or cooks or chefs, or
work at supermarkets.
Yeah, work at supermarkets or something like that, and I think that's what I did like about the Roseanne Barr show. It kind of brought things down to earth, and so some real struggling families. That was more common. Cool. But anyway, I digress on that. All right. So you tell me, what are some comedians that you're excited, unless you have some other stuff as far as 90s is concerned, what are some comedians you're excited about today? Or in the last, since 2000. Let's do it from 2000.
Well, when you said today, I actually had something queued up. So we can backtrack a little bit. One of the things I just wanted to say is, because we're now living in, well, they keep calling it the post-COVID world. COVID is still very much with us. So I'm going to say in this new normal, if that's what you want to say. What I've noticed, YouTube, our venue, has become a huge venue for many stand-up comedians.
Yeah.
And it seems to be great for them, because the clubs took such a bath during the whole shutdown and haven't really fully recovered as yet today. Stephen Hofstetter, are you familiar with him?
No, I'm not.
He is today's version of the angry young man. He's great. Most of his bits are him tearing hecklers to pieces. So if you like to watch people giving bullies their comeuppance, he's great. But there's any number of others. There's been a lot of young up-and-comers who I think have had a chance to break through thanks to YouTube. There's a young lady named Julie Noak from Canada who was a comedian and started doing these posts on YouTube and has had some huge traction with that. John Mulaney, I think, is doing better on YouTube now than he was on SNL.
John Mulaney was hilarious. I mean, he still is. He's hilarious. I love John Mulaney. Yeah.
But I think one of the things, and again, I don't want to give the game away, but since we're talking about now, and I think one of the things that really bothers me is, and I'm hesitant to use the word Orwellian because it's so overused these days. Comedy used to be a venue for free thought, for cutting edge, for pressing the envelope.
Yes.
Was it always in good taste? No. But it was a way of saying, Joan Rivers' famous phrase, can we talk? Can we talk? Yeah. It's like, how about we just try to act like adults? We're going to talk about some adult subject matter. If you're offended, don't be. I'm not trying to offend anyone, but here's my set. It may offend people of this group, that group, but can't we all just have a good laugh? It's all in good fun. In today's world, there's none of that. People are very easily triggered. And I was just reading an article, actually, in preparation for this show, where it talked about stand-up comedians have bailed on the college circuit in droves because they're told you can't say anything which could trigger the audience.
Trigger words and all that stuff.
Today,
yeah,
that's everything. Everything is sexist. Everything is racist. Everything is hate speech. Everything is, and they're like, you know what? I'm out.
Yeah.
And it's a pity because it's caused a substantial drop in quality. It's certainly cleaner, but it's no more entertaining.
No, it's not.
And
It's
that's my
not
two
fun.
cents.
And I think that actually people who the whole college going to colleges, that's been put on hold. I mean, I mean, people are comedians can't do their act at colleges. They just can't.
Precisely.
And so the people, the college kids are suffering from that. Um, yeah, I don't like that either. I just don't like that cancel culture. I just, the idea. But I think people who do listen to comedy listen to it anyway, and people who do comedy do it anyway, and they just find places to do it. But they've
YouTube.
yeah, YouTube until they get taken off or something like that or
Well,
whatever. No,
and they will.
but well, some of my favorite comedians that have come up since the 2000s have been Dimitri Martin. Um, Definitely, we just mentioned him. We just mentioned him. I forgot his name just now. We just mentioned the kid that
Oh,
it'll come back to me.
I can't think of it.
But
That ADHD of mine. I've
yeah,
already forgot what we were talking about.
Dimitri Martin
But
I
it'll
thought
come
was
back to me.
hilarious. And the other guy that I think is about my favorite comedian right now is Nate Bargatze. I don't know if you've listened to Nate Bargatze or
I'm
not.
not familiar with him.
Oh, if do you have Netflix or no?
Yes, I have Netflix.
Okay, so if you go to so listen to it in this order. There's a show called The Stand-Ups. He does the very first
Mm-hmm.
one, and then he's got
Mm-hmm.
the Tennessee Kid. So the Stand-Ups is a half hour. Then he does the Tennessee Kid, which is an hour, and he does the Greatest Average American, which is his latest one. That's fantastic. And there's another guy named Tommy Johnigan who has three albums. They're not videos, they're just audio, they're just CDs. You can get it on our, downloads. He's hilarious too. I think he's very funny. Um, there's probably tons of them. John Mulaney, that's the person I was thinking of.
Oh yes, okay, yes, yes. And I kind of have a weak spot for Peter Davidson from SNL.
Oh, okay.
He's he's the one who got into a lot of flack because he picked on a congressman who was wounded in the wars, and it was said in good fun, and the congressman himself laughed it off, but a lot
Oh,
of people took umbrage to it. So he got a lot of negative feedback. But
yeah.
I do like he's the young man. He his father was killed in 9/11. His father was a
Oh
firefighter
no.
who died and he has battled mental illness throughout his life. So he's overcome quite a bit. That's a huge, large part of his act. He actually had a movie that it ended up going straight to Netflix. Speaking of Netflix, because it was went to be released during the COVID shutdown, and I can't remember what it was called, but it's about a kid from Staten Island whose mother is remarrying, and he doesn't want his mom to remarry. And the new guy is played by Bill Burr,
Oh,
who I
Bill
think is
Burr.
very funny.
He's funny.
Bill Burr, Bill Burr who's very funny, and I never get a chance to see it because I stopped watching movies, but it
Yeah.
looked very good. But I think Peter Davidson, um, just from what he's overcome, is worth listening to, and he's usually actually I think he's very, very funny.
Oh,
Although,
yeah.
again, he presses the envelope.
Yeah, I think I do know who you're talking about now. Oh, and another comedian we forgot to mention is King Baby. What's his name?
Oh,
Look, I'm gonna
come
look it up.
on, pray.
I'm gonna look it up right now because there's just no
Please
way that
do.
I am gonna uh, want to forget this guy here. Uh,
I'll wait patiently.
Jim Gaffigan. Jim Gaffigan, man, that guy's
Jim Gaffigan.
hilarious. Yeah. And then we forgot to mention
Hot
Seinfeld.
pockets.
Yeah.
Mm.
There hasn't been too much that Jim Gaffigan's done that I have not very much enjoyed. Jim Gaffigan's hilarious. And there's another guy called Greg Warren. I don't know if you've listened to him or not, but he's got
Can't
like
place it.
3 albums, but he's funny, but like half of each one of his albums the same as the last. You know what I mean? He kind of says the same things over again. And it's just like, you know, it's
Yeah,
like,
you know,
okay.
it's the same shtick, just rehashed. You know, who used to do that all the time. I still love him though. Who used to do that? Dennis Leary.
Oh yeah.
Dennis Leary is he has the same joke structure. He
Yeah.
just it's like an erector set. He just keeps building the same joke into different bits. You know, he actually he and I share this. This is weird. He and I share the same birthday,
Oh really?
exactly 10 years apart, and we were both in the same neighborhood in Worcester, Mass. So it's really fun. There's a certain synchronicity there.
Really? Wow.
Yeah.
Crazy.
So it's when he was having breakfast on his 10th birthday, I was being born. And again, Worcester represented.
Yeah.
I first left when I was a kid. He left years ago too.
Right.
Small world.
Yeah. Well, that Nate Bargatze though, look those up. Those are hilarious. Those are really worth listening to. They're funny.
So
Yeah.
I certainly will. Because I was looking for a good comedian, especially
And
these days.
and I'm always
There you go.
interested. I'll drill you on it because I'm always interested in what people think about him. He's hilarious though. He really is really super good. Took him a long time to get famous. He started way back in the 2000s, like early 2000s, and he's just getting famous
Yeah.
now. He's just starting to come into his own. He's got his own podcast as well called Nate Land, which is pretty funny to listen to. It's a little boring, but oh well. I mean, I still listen to it because I'm a huge fan, but he's good. All right. Well, I think we've hit all the major. We didn't say anything about Seinfeld. Seinfeld was hilarious.
He certainly was. It was a great show. And well, there was a lot of shows around that time where the idea was you would take a stand-up comedian and give them their own show. And
Yes.
as we talked about with some other comedians, it
Yeah.
usually didn't quite work. But with Seinfeld, it did.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
thought, and I think that had to do more with the fact that not only was he very funny, but the ensemble cast he put together was
Yeah.
very good.
Ray Romano had that happen to him. A lot of comedians had that happen to him. I think that started with Cosby, quite honestly. I think that started with him
Yeah,
because like he
it
would
sure
just
did.
tell his stand up about what's happening in his family, and then they said, "Hey, let's just do a show based on your family." And I think that happened quite a bit, like you were saying, yeah. And
Well, I
Seinfeld
remember
too, not about his
Randy
family, but
Quaid. Oh yeah, Randy Quaid actually had a very, very, very short-lived show, and it was a great premise. Everyone, with the exception of a couple of the children, because it was supposed to be like a family man, everyone in the show was a stand-up comedian. Jonathan Winters played his live-in father. Um, a comedian played his ex-wife.
mm,
He was a school principal, I think, or a school teacher or something. And the entire cast of the school was comprised of stand-up comedians. So they literally they took an entire conglomeration of stand-up comedians and made a show with them. And I don't know if it was like Yellowbeard, where it was just too many cooks spoil the broth. It was just too
yeah.
much. But the whole thing only lasted about 5 or 6 episodes. But I thought it was a great premise.
I'll have to look into that. I love watching shows, old shows that you can find on YouTube sometimes that like only had a few episodes or whatever, and you're like, oh, whoa, very interesting. Sometimes they'll be on YouTube. You can find them. Jeff Foxworthy had that happen to him too. Had a short-lived show. Yeah,
He sure did. He sure
yeah.
did.
That was just a thing. Comedians were hoping to get television shows. They're like, oh, you tell your comedy, then somebody builds a show around your comedy. Yeah, that was a thing. It doesn't. That's not a thing anymore these days, as far as I know. I can't think of
It
one.
might make a comeback. Well, I mean, think about it. They don't have to go on the road, and it's steady employment. What
Yes.
could be better for anyone in entertainment?
Right. Right.
So yes.
Well, all right, Thrash Pondo. We're gonna call this
Mm-hmm.
a show. I really appreciate you doing this for me. First of all, before we go, tell everybody where they can find you.
You can find me at Thrashpondo Ponds on YouTube. That's capital THRASHPONDO, capital PONS. Um, I have some new plans for some upcoming events, but I have some plenty of old stuff that I'm sure you'll all find funny. Please give me a like, subscribe, and await the new content.
Yes. Please do, and I'll leave a link to your the link to your channel in the description box below. Wow. All right.
Thank you so much.
Yes. And
We all knew we were going with it. We all knew we were going.
and please don't forget to like this, comment,
Of course.
subscribe, share on your favorite social media. And if you're listening to this on podcast form, please leave me a review and a rating. And if you are listening to this podcast form, there's a lot of stuff I'm doing on YouTube right now that's exclusive to YouTube. So go on over there and check it out. And also follow the link below to my Patreon page, where I am going to be adding a tier on there where you'll get exclusive content early. So you'll get it at least a day early. And I'm going to be recording everything in advance, and I'm going to be releasing it on Patreon before. But right now over there, if you like what we're doing and you just want to give me a tip jar, there's a tip jar over there. It's just $3 a month. But the next level up is going to be $5 a month, and that's going to be where you're going to get all exclusive content. And then I'm going to be adding tiers to that as well. We'll be doing exclusive interviews as well over there, and maybe some behind the scenes stuff. And if you're interested, Thrashpondo and I are actually going to be on this Monday night. We're going to be with Chris from Redbeard Video. We're going to be talking about music, and we're going to be taking live Q&A on music with Chris from Redbeard Video. So, all right, everyone, thank you so much for joining.
A lot of fun.
Yes, a lot of cussing too. Just be prepared. We'll see you next time.